Good morning. You're watching me via video this morning because of, as we all know, of the COVID-19 pandemic. Listen, we love you and we love our community and our neighbors, and we want to make sure that we show some concern by what we're doing. So that's what we're doing. I know that's some sacrifice for us, not just in terms of our church life, but our work life and our home life as well. But be patient. We do that not out of fear, but we do that out of love for one another. And we'll do our best to keep connected with all of you during this time. And as such, we are providing resources for you on our website, on our app, on our Facebook page that allow you to do some worship at home with your family or just by yourself. You'll have a short service printed out for you on a PDF. And you'll have Carolyn's Bible class recorded with her slides, as well as this sermon with my sermon slides to be part of that service for you. So we don't want you to miss anything, and that's going to be new content each week as God allows us. And hopefully by the time on or before we get to Easter, we'll all be back together again. So hang in there. Give me a call or an email or a text if there's something that you need in the meantime. Please pay attention to that letter that you hopefully receive before you've watched this, or check our Facebook page for all the updated details on what's closed, what we're doing, and how you can access stuff. So thank you for that. Thank you for your prayers. Today we're in our gospel readings in Luke 16 and Luke 17. I want to tell you a story. Back several years ago when our girls were very little, we went to visit our friends the Schwiegers over in St. Clair on the east side of the state. And one of the activities we had on that Labor Day is that we drove from their house down to the river, literally across the street downtown, to a little ice cream store that was open on Labor Day. And the view was great, looking at the St. Clair River. We walked in, the 8 of us, each of ours from our separate cars. Carolyn left her purse in our car, and I locked up the car. We walked in, had our ice cream, enjoyed the time. We walked back out to the car. I stuck my hand in my pocket, my left pocket, where I always put my keys, only to discover I did not have the keys in the car. So I went back into the ice cream store thinking they had fallen out where we were sitting. There were no keys to be found. I walked back out to the car, and I looked in the car, and there were my keys in the ignition. Both sets of our keys, Carolyn's and mine, were locked inside the car. Have you ever locked your keys in the car? Let me tell you, when it's on Labor Day and you're out of town and you have to find a locksmith who's willing to come on a holiday and let you out, well, needless to say, we paid a lot extra to have him come. And you struggle when that happens to you. You know, some of it's panic. What am I going to do? Some of it's frustration, and you're pounding your head saying, I can't believe I was this stupid. How could I lock my keys in the car? We kind of spring that kind of a trap on ourselves when we do that, when we're forgetful. Well, the ancient Greeks had a word for that sort of thing. The word is called scandalon. We get the English word scandal from it. Its root word literally meant to snap shut. And you have the picture there on the slide with you of, there you see a cat in a box with a stick holding up the box, the box. And the scandalon is that stick. You tie the bait to that stick. The animal comes in, grabs the bait, pulling the stick, trapping the animal, and now you have trapped yourself as the animal and volunteered to be the next meal for whatever person has set the trap for you. In the Bible, that word is often used as well to describe someone who's enticing or tempting someone to sin. Now, when we get into the context or the pretext of our text, in Luke chapters 14 through 16, Jesus has been speaking to the Pharisees, among other people in the crowd. And just as a reminder, the Pharisees were lay people who were religiously devoted to keeping God's commandments, his 10 commandments. They had even come up with literally hundreds of other man-made commandments of their own to try to help them keep God's 10. As a result of their religious passion and fervor and strict obedience to God's laws, they were often looked up to as the role models for how we should live out our life with God. And sadly, because they were sinners just like us, that adoration and high esteem of the people led to arrogance and pride in many of them. Apparently, in the Pharisees that had been talking with Jesus in chapters 14 through 16 in Luke, they also had another problem, avarice. Now, avarice is simply an extreme greed for material wealth. And so Jesus, in trying to deal with them and help them grow in their faith, tells them a parable. You see, the challenge that they had is often the challenge that you and I have. We get focused on the moment and the immediate and of the things that we can hold in our hand and see and touch and accumulate and gain. And oftentimes we let that be the source of our security and our hope, and sometimes as we chase after it, even our God. And that's what was true for the Pharisees that Jesus was talking with. And what we also know is while they focused on those things, they weren't focused on their life with God. They weren't focused on God's forgiveness. And they weren't focused on where their life was leading them as they pursued that material gain and wealth. That's why Jesus tells this parable. It's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And this parable is really, it's not meant to really describe the specifics of heaven and hell. But it is meant to point out and to get people to think about what is the eternal, permanent outcome of the course of life that they set, especially in terms of the point of comparison between those who are focused on walking by faith with God, Lazarus, and the rich man who are focused on living out and pursuing the pleasures and joys of material wealth. And as Jesus is telling this parable, the rich man is literally, we'd call him a playboy today. He wore rich clothes, rich, expensive underwear and outerwear. He was partying with his friends all the time. He was enjoying all the pleasures that life and money could buy. Out at his gate was Lazarus. Some think it was the Lazarus that was Jesus' friend, the brother of Mary and Martha. There's nothing to indicate that that's exactly who Jesus meant, but a lot of people like to think about that. But this Lazarus, as he's being talked to, and by the way, the name Lazarus means God helps me. This Lazarus is a poor beggar. He is sick. He's suffering from disease. He's abandoned. He's alone. And he is very hungry and poor. The only thing that these two people have in common, as Jesus tells this parable, is this: they both die. That's the common result of earthly life for everyone, no matter what station in life we find ourselves in. But what happens as Jesus continues to tell the parable is that the outcomes of the lives of these two men are dramatically different. The rich man who had pleasure and joy in life but was not focused on God found himself in agony and torment in hell. While Lazarus, the poor man who hoped and trusted in God and his promises, ends up in paradise with Abraham, the father of Israel. Well, the rich man, in his torment in hell, looks up and sees Abraham in paradise, and he says, "Father Abraham, could you dip your finger in water and touch my tongue? This temporary, small, limited reprieve from my suffering would be of great help." Abraham says that, no, that's not possible. And then he says, well, then send Lazarus back from the dead. And then have him go warn my brothers, because they tell them not to be here where I'm at. And then Jesus makes a very big point here at the end. And I think that the warning that Jesus is giving to the Pharisees, and really to us as we struggle with the same sort of things, getting focused on the here and now and the pleasures of life and what that can mean and how important that is to us. Using that Greek word scandalon again, that's our focus for today, he's warning us not to take the bait of things that are short-lived and temporary in life as if they are the focus and point of life, and to become our God, what we pursue and think is the only thing we've got to have. He's warning us, saying, don't spring that scandalon on yourself. Don't spring the trap on yourself because that kind of life can lead to the same outcome as this rich man in the parable. In fact, the lesson Jesus is trying to teach is at verse 31, at the very end, he says, Abraham is saying this in the parable. If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced if someone rises from the dead. They didn't believe Jesus and the disciples as they talked about Jesus' resurrection, and they certainly, so the point is, listen to what God has to say. Believe his promises and his words and take them to heart. That's the key to impacting how our life ends, what the outcome of our life is, not how much wealth we accumulate. Well, then we get into Luke chapter 17, and the focus, the audience of the conversation with Jesus changes from the Pharisees to the disciples. And I think the point Jesus is making here in Luke 17, while in 16 it is to the Pharisees, don't spring the trap, the scandalon on yourself. Think about, beware of what your life is, where your life is leading you to, and make sure it's one that trusts in God's word that leads you to heaven. And here in chapter 17, it's not don't spring the trap on yourself. It's don't set the trap and spring it at other people. Let me give you that this line of thinking that Jesus has here is that we ought to be concerned not just about ourselves, but our neighbors, is the same line of thinking that we have used in some of the decisions and choices that we and many others are making among churches in our country and those in authority in our country and our state. We got to be thinking, not only can I escape the COVID-19 infection, but I want to make sure it's not going to be, I'm not going to be the vehicle by which somebody else is afflicted and possibly dies from either. Well, Jesus first makes a general point here, and he says, watch yourselves. Think about the witness of your words and actions, especially how they impact those who are young in age and especially young in the faith, or who are pre-faith. They are still seeking or looking, and they're getting their opinion, their understanding of what it means to walk with Christ and have a life headed for heaven from you and me. Let me give you an example. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, my family, my mom and dad and my sisters and I went to the home of my uncle, my dad's brother, to visit for the evening. We had dinner, sat down, then we broke up to play. The adults went to talk and have a few drinks in the living room, and my sisters and I went with my cousins to the bedroom. They kept the door of the bedroom open because, you know, if you're parents, you always know you've got to be listening to what these kids are getting to, because if they can find some way to get in trouble, they always will. Well, we're sitting there playing, and I overhear my uncle very loudly use and very passionately use a word I had never heard before in my life. I love my uncle. I always thought he was a great guy. And I decided then that I would increase my vocabulary and I would repeat the word and try it out in my own conversation with my cousin. So just as loudly, just as passionately, I used this brand new word in my vocabulary to my cousin. Upon me speaking those words, almost immediately my uncle came rushing into the bedroom where we were playing. He shook his finger at me and says, "Don't you ever say that word. That's a bad word." "But uncle, I just heard you say it." "I don't care, it's a bad word. Don't you ever say it." And then he stormed off. I have to confess to you that was the first time I ever cussed in my life. You've got to pay attention, because people are watching, especially the young in age and the young in faith. And they're looking to us and to the witness of our words and actions. And that's what I think Jesus is pointing us to in Luke chapter 17. At least in the first general point he's making is, watch yourselves and the witness that you're making. Be vigilant about that. In fact, Jesus says here at the beginning of Luke 17, he says, things that cause people to sin are bound to come. But woe to the person by whom they come. So watch yourselves. And then Jesus gets real focused on one specific issue. We touched on it last week. If you were here with us in church, you can view that sermon on who's the greatest on our website or on our app or on our YouTube channel. But Jesus is talking in view of forgiveness and forgiving one another. He's saying, let's not create the scandal of causing someone else to grow weaker in the faith or even lose their faith or prevent them from coming to faith by our refusing or limiting our forgiveness of someone else. That what he's calling us to is to be a people who follow him, who on every occasion, as often as needed, forgives those who sin against us, especially when they are repentant, remorseful, and sorry. That's the gospel way. That's the way of grace that God how he treats us and how he's calling us to treat one another. Well, the disciples immediately cry out, "Lord, increase our faith." They're probably like us. As Jesus has been teaching, they hear what he says to the Pharisees and also to them. And they're suddenly realizing, hey, we haven't been paying attention to where our words and actions may be leading us personally, or how they may be trapping us personally for eternity. And secondly, even if we're concerned and paying attention to that, we aren't always living with the awareness of others and the impact that our words and actions may have on them and their faith, or their coming to faith. So the disciples cry out, "Lord, increase our faith," and maybe we do, and we probably should too. Well, how do we make progress? How do we become the people that God has called us to be and God in grace has declared us to be? Well, we make our start and we set our anchor in Jesus, don't we? The Bible tells us that he was made to be a scandalon for us on the cross, that he literally pulled the stick out from the trap of our sin on himself, suffering and dying for its wages so that we could have forgiveness and life. So for you and me, as we live our life in faith and by faith in the world, may we always be captured by Christ and his mercy and grace, so that we are a people who are always thinking about the impact of our words and actions and how we might be able to positively influence those who are young in the faith, young in age, and maybe even don't know anything about God, and they're taking their cue from us. Let me close with these words of encouragement. It comes from our proverb for today, Proverbs 16. This is in verse 20. "Whoever gives thought to the word will discover good, and blessed is he who trusts in the Lord." Give thought to the good news of Jesus. Dwell in his mercy and grace, and let your witness and of your actions and words of his forgiveness drive that same mercy and grace shown to others through you. And this is what we ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. Stay tuned. We're praying for you. If you have some need, please text me, call me, or email me, and just know that we're praying for you during this time. Thanks.